Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 97 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host for this one, Andy Whiteside. Hopefully, not hopefully, I know Barry Brown and his team are doing some of the community versions of this, but this is our more corporate version where we talk about the blogs that IGEL puts out. And we've got a very hot topic for today that Chris Feeney, who's with me here, is going to help me cover. And we can go super deep, or we can go super wide, or we can do a little of both. Chris, how's it going?
It's going well, Andy. It's always a pleasure to get with you, and what a time to be alive. I mean, it's an interesting world we live in. Some of those things we'll talk about today, we've been talking about for quite a while anyway, so it's not necessarily new, but it's new from a different angle that I don't think any of us ever thought would happen. But yeah,
Well, you know what,
uh,
Chris? It happens all the time. And here's what I mean. It happens to the common user all day, every day. Here's the blog is from July 19th. It's from Andy Pryor. I think must be on the IGEL team somewhere or somewhere in the ecosystem. And the title of this blog is Don't Use Windows Unless You Have to Use Windows, Microsoft Windows. Oh, wait a minute. That's not the title. The title is How to Recover Blue Screens Windows Endpoints Using the IGEL OS. Chris, I know we're going to talk about the thing that happened, and we're going to talk about your vacation, and we're going to talk about airline madness associated with the CrowdStrike security patch that went out roughly 5 or 6 days ago. But Chris, true or false? For the last 3 or 4 years, however long you've been at IGEL, you have gone to airports and seen blue screens of death at airport commonly.
well, definitely not every time, but definitely I've seen them. Yes.
So this thing we're going to talk about today has been happening for a long time, and people have just been okay with it until it happened bad enough where it's now caused issues, and people are upset about it right now. But they'll forget about it in 3 months, and we'll be back to business as usual. They'll forget about it in 2 weeks, business as usual. But it's going to happen again. It's like pandemics once in a lifetime, I hope. But viruses are common every winter, all throughout the year even. Blue screens of death happen all the time. It's just we mitigate the impact, hopefully. This time we did.
Well, I learned a thing about how blue screen actually occurs. Researched that coming back from vacation as I was seeing it happen play out live and into the weekend.
So
But yeah,
tell us about that, because a lot of people see blue screens and they don't associate it with what's really happening. You tell us what happens when you see a blue screen on a Windows computer.
so it really kind of it's an understanding of how an operating system works, right? So there are there's OS itself, and then the OS has a kernel which interoperates with the hardware. IGEL is a Linux OS. We have a kernel that interoperates with the hardware. Then you have third-party applications that can run on the OS, and generally speaking, those third-party apps should not have kernel access. Um, and in the case of a blue screen, that's Windows responding to something that is occurring in a kernel driver or system driver. Those require elevated privileges, and it's basically saying, generally speaking, my general understanding is it was trying to call a place in memory
Yeah.
reserved for this, special privileged area, and Windows was like, nope, and it
Yeah.
does what it does as a protective mechanism.
It's the old TV show from the 60s and 70s. Danger, Will Robinson. Danger, Will Robinson. Here's your blue screen. Stop.
Right, and if it's not a kernel driver, then basically the operating system will kill the process because it doesn't have that system level kernel driver sort of scenario.
Yeah.
Um,
Hey, real quick, let's
and
define driver as software, whether it's driving hardware, whether it's software application running. In this case, is maybe security related things within the operating system, and hopefully not in the kernel. The kernel is very important and very protected. The way I describe a kernel to someone who knows anything about biology, it's like the hypothalamus of the human being.
yeah, and if you need to know what that is, go back to seventh grade biology and read up. Just do a Google search on hypothalamus. But the point is, the kernel is, I mean, that's sort of the foundational piece. That's the stuff. Your Apple iPhone, your Google Android they all have a kernel, and that interoperates with the hardware that you're running on, and that's just how an OS works.
Hey, real quick, what is the
Um,
kernel of Windows 11 called?
oh man,
It's easy. It's Windows NT. It's the same thing that's been around since the
oh,
90s.
right.
Multi-user kernel, Windows NT versus Windows 95 and Windows 98. What was the kernel for that? Super easy.
Oh, it was. Dang it, I know it because NT was the that's what
It was
changed things.
DOS. It was DOS.
DOS, yeah, MS DOS, yeah,
Yeah.
32-bit.
And hey,
Um,
what's the original name of the DOS operating system? TOS.
OS2,
No, TOS.
TOS.
Yeah,
Interesting.
you know what T stood for?
No.
Trash. Trash operating system. Long story there, but nonetheless, DOS, which Microsoft got from I think Xerox and helped IBM with something. Anyway, long story there, but the point is the kernel. We got to protect the kernel. Got to protect the kernel. Our kernels today in the mainstream are two. Linux is a kernel, and Windows NT is a kernel. NT is a kernel. Those are the two kernels in the x86 world normally.
Right. Yeah. So what's interesting here is obviously what was unique about this particular situation with CrowdStrike, and it's obviously a very well known company, lots of customers, protecting a very well entrenched operating system out there in the world. Um, from the things we talk about these ransomware and what ransomware tries to do, and gain kernel access or hardware. And so this particular
Can
software
we talk
has
about that
special
super quick?
privileges.
Can we talk about that
Oh,
super quick? Because you're going to lead
sure.
in, you're going to want to cover here. Windows is my favorite operating system. Microsoft Windows is my favorite operating system. It's what I built my career on. It's super, super by default coded to be unbelievably malleable and powerful, which is what allows it to do so many great things. It's also what allows so many people to do so many bad things. Does that
Oh
make sense?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we've talked about this before, you know, well, when IGEL's been doing OS stuff for 20 some odd years. Linux has been around for just over 30. So, um, but it was designed from the ground up from a security perspective to have a minimalist approach and a read-only scenario that you could manage the devices as well from a scaling perspective.
Yeah.
So just a different approach to an OS that was built for a specific purpose. Accessing remote, or not necessarily remote all the time, but even terminal emulators, could be fine, whatever. But yeah, but in this specific situation, you've got a very powerful piece of software designed to protect that had a regular update. You have many updates over time, and this one particular caused an issue that unfortunately affected millions of machines.
So, Chris,
Oh,
I want to get back to the let's run Windows where you need to run Windows and everywhere else you don't need to run it, don't run it conversation. But I do want to ask you a question because I don't know the answer to this. I keep meaning to listen to podcasts and try to read up on this, and I don't know if it's public knowledge yet. But what went wrong this time? Was there no change control? Was there no testing? Was there rogue person that caused this? Do you know what the issue was here? Because look, CrowdStrike's a big boy company. They've got mitigations in place to prevent this from happening. What went wrong?
I haven't seen anything. I mean, maybe something's come out since the weekend. I haven't seen anything yet. Um, I mean, so I can't definitively answer that question. It would seem that something in the QA process got missed or whatever, somehow where this would have been caught early before it got out the door. That would be the general operating theory, in my opinion, but I can't say for sure exactly.
I mean,
I'm
at a
sure.
minimum, you hope they had some kind of canary concept where they rolled it out to a portion of the environment and they didn't try to roll it and not the whole thing. And they didn't try to roll it out to everybody, but it feels like they rolled it out to everybody. Like somebody told somebody, "Hey, I don't know, just hit the button."
Yeah, and I was trying to catch up on what happened. I just don't know exactly what what happened in this particular scenario, other than the update got out and caused obviously a large impact
Yeah.
that is still being felt. Um,
Well,
but
let's try to revisit that on a future podcast once we know, because I
yeah,
want people to know what, how not to do this. I mean, this happens every day with inside corporations. It just doesn't make the news because it doesn't have as big an impact.
yeah, no doubt. So today's topic is really on this blog. If you find yourself in a situation where the operating system, in this case, running Windows, you have a B-side and you somehow can't get out of this, what they refer to as a boot loop, essentially. You go to boot and bam, you hit the B-side and you can't get out of it. Well, the options that we kind of highlight are not, for those that have listened to the podcast and know IGEL, it's not something that we're necessarily brand new with a solution. The UD Pocket is certainly a very, it's built for bypassing the local hard drive on the machine and then just booting to it. Now, obviously, to get to that, you have to be able to allow booting to a USB. So that would require getting into what is called the UEFI, or uh, other people know it as BIOS. And so you may require some, depending on your hardware, HP, Lenovo, LG, whatever, they all different sort of how to get into the BIOS or the boot menu, and then you can pick an alternate option to boot from. So that's probably the easiest way to get to that. But there are some caveats.
Chris, what does BIOS stand for?
Oh man,
Basic input.
basic inter. Damn it.
I
Sorry.
think it's basic input operating system or basic interrupt
Yes.
operating system.
Yeah,
It's
that's
machine
where I was
code.
going.
It's machine code to get you to the boot files of the operating system so that the kernel can take over.
Right.
And what you're talking about is the BIOS configuration screens.
Right. So I've got a laptop here on my left that I've got two different laptops. One, I can boot directly to USB because I've got it set to do that in the boot order. The other one I don't. It boots directly to the hard drive, but if I want to boot to USB, I just got to go and hit the escape key or whatever, F10, and then I get the boot menu and I can choose to boot to a UD Pocket. So but you can change that if you have BIOS access, and you can do that. So that's one way you can kind of recover, at least get a machine operational, and then you can come back. In this particular situation, the fix for B-side might be, you know, very specific, or who knows, it might need to be re-imaged or something. But
Yeah, and I'm curious, maybe what did they do to fix this? Because you're in a situation where you can't boot, so therefore you can't phone home. Did they have to, how did they get the software patch out to fix the problem if you couldn't actually start the car and drive it to the dealership?
my general understanding is, in the case of CrowdStrike, is that the fix is to remove what was put on there that's causing the blue screen of death. Um, but to do that, you have to be able to get to what's called safe mode or recovery mode, command line essentially,
Mhm.
and then go through and follow some instructions.
Yeah.
But one of the other challenges that people are saying is that if you have the BitLocker disk encryption, then you have to know the BitLocker key,
Mm.
and that could be different for every machine, which would probably be the right best practice. Or some corporations may have the same BitLocker key for all their machines, for convenience sake. It all depends, but that can throw a wrinkle in it.
I'm curious how
Um,
many of these machines were virtual and they could be snapshotted back before the patch.
Read some stuff, and certainly I know Scott Manchester put out a note about Cloud PC and going back and rolling back to a snapshot. So that certainly is an approach where that could definitely occur.
Did he also put
Virtualizing
something?
Windows.
Did he
What?
also put something in about non-persistent VMs and just rebooting them back to where they started?
I didn't read that necessarily. There may be others that have chimed in, but certainly, this kind of goes back to the persistent, non-persistence
Yeah, what I'm getting at in that
conversation.
response, Chris, is Windows 365 is not the answer to everything if you know the truth. If you don't know the truth, people can make you feel like it's the answer to every problem.
Yeah, well, a different product in the cloud for Microsoft than AVD. Everything has its pros and cons.
My answer to this problem is not more Microsoft. Certainly not on the endpoint. That's for
What
sure.
is your answer, Andy?
My answer is don't drive your car to meet the Uber. Get
You've used that analogy before.
Yeah, I mean
Uh,
take a bike down the street or walk, but don't get in your car to go meet an Uber, or don't take an Uber to meet an Uber.
yeah, that would seem very interesting. We've talked about it before. I mean, um, but yeah, so the options that are laid out here in a DR scenario, which is obviously what you're dealing with globally in many cases, IGEL certainly has the ability to try to boot to our UD pocket. Um, and the other option is highlighted there is kind of booting and actually installing IGEL on the device, which would, in theory, blow away the operating system on the device. Um, or I think actually now that I read it more, he's referring to um, booting to the OS creator to then install the OS on a second USB stick, um, kind of like a UD Pocket. Now, that would be an extreme sort of scenario in the sense that if it's not a UD Pocket, an actual UD Pocket has a serialized number on it that is very specific to be able to unplug that device and plug it into other ones. Creating a UD Pocket on a separate USB stick could be done, but it's only going to be isolated to the first machine that boots up, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's not portable. So, but if you're in a tight spot, that may be your only option until you can get the original hard drive fixed or whatever.
Well, let me say what you just said differently. OS creator, create another USB drive, get a UD pocket. That'll get you through this gap, this space and time. Then come up with a strategy on how you're going to mitigate Windows, Microsoft Windows, which I love. You're going to mitigate it where it needs to be mitigated and use it where it needs to be used.
Definitely. We've talked many times over about just endpoint strategy and pros and cons of uh, using IGEL. Sometimes you just need a browser. Sometimes you need a browser and a desktop of sorts, a virtual desktop.
Yeah.
But
Look,
from a
in my dream world, you've got a resilient platform like a Nutanix with Windows VMs on it, desktops and app servers that boot back to a gold image that presents, not delivers, but presents it down to a Linux-based endpoint. And all that is a read-only operating systems all the way up through that. And Chris, the only thing you would need at that point is limited rights for the end users that are using the system and some type of lightweight antivirus malware detecting software is all you would need in that scenario versus a big, massive product like CrowdStrike.
Hmm, yeah,
That's all it takes. But
yeah,
people default to installing big, heavy, bloated, amazingly capable Windows on everything because it's the path of least resistance and it's the easiest thing to do because it's what you've always done. But someday we're going to figure out that we can't keep doing that because there's too many bad actors out there or too many incompetent technology companies that have access here.
yeah. I will say, um, just in we to the folks that are dealing with it on the front lines. I mean, I know our thoughts go with you. I mean, it's not easy given the instructions that are there to try to recover. There's I've seen some details about maybe how to automate some stuff. We're talking about physical endpoints.
But but Chris, I'm going to pull an Andy on you. Those are the same people that are protecting that turf and won't work with their companies to find smarter, better ways.
That could be very true. And I know you've dealt with it personally. So, um, yeah. So
And
there
look, there
are,
historically there have been reasons why from a user experience, but for the most part, those things are gone. And you really can have a good user experience, if not great user experience, and mitigate windows on the endpoint.
yeah. And I think we've talked about this. We've now on podcast 97. I guarantee you we've had this same topic conversation about user experience running Linux on IGEL Linux on the endpoint in 50 of those episodes easily.
Yeah.
And so this is not necessarily a new topic for us, but it's really just, the understanding what's possible, and what user experience, can. I mean, just for me, I've tried to, emulate that. I've talked about it before. We presented at one of your kickoffs a couple years ago, and I wanted to make sure I did it from my IGEL device, and I just used the Edge browser and logged into the browser and pulled up Teams and just used that to present everything from the browser, and it worked flawlessly.
Yeah.
So, and it, like I said, it was a great user experience, generally speaking. No hiccups. So it doesn't. I think people need to understand
And
that's what
Chris,
you can deliver.
that was a little bit of an extreme use case for that person that sits down at their desk, either at the home office, the remote office, or in the headquarters every day. It's not an extreme use case anymore. It can just work.
Absolutely. So,
So, Chris, I think we've covered it here. I've, said my piece. You said your piece. I just want the world to know that it's okay to run Windows on servers. Ideally, you're running server core and not full blown Windows. That would get rid of a lot of the security risk right there. Run Windows on endpoints makes sense when it's the right use case. I've got 1, 2, 3 laptops running Windows around me right now, and one all-in-one running Linux. But on any given day, I'd grab one of those laptops and I jump on an airplane and I travel and go do what I do. Could I make IGEL work for that? Yes. Is it the right thing for that power user? Probably not. But is the one that sits on my desk all day or the one that sits on the airline terminal counter the right thing to run Windows on? Probably not.
yeah, I think it comes down to what do you need that thing to do? And um, is that for me, walking around the airport, seeing a lot of these display boards, I mean, that's a very, we've actually got a press release back in June with LG talking about that specific use case
Yeah.
in display boards.
And how many of those display boards are clearly a much older operating system that have their own set of challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the user's not generally interacting with the board. It's just there. I mean, you can put whatever. So that's just a simple scenario where, you know, obviously keep it up and running. You can put information about what's happening. But I mean, to walk around and see these messages, I mean, it's, and then to understand that it's not isolated to that one particular location, it's happening globally. Really kind of think from wow, I didn't realize, you know,
Think
personally how many machines were out there running Windows,
think about how silly
doing,
this is, but a bad actor could be a 14-year-old kid in his basement, or it could be a foreign government, could literally hack a company like American Airlines' kiosk terminals running Windows and just change the flight numbers around all over the country and have an economic impact on the United States of America.
that kind of scenario could certainly play out potentially. So
It'd be super easy. Yeah. Chris, thank you for the time covering this. Always good to chat about this one. This one, if you're a golfer, was teed up so high and so perfectly to talk about. And guess what? It happens every day in some organization. It's always the right time to be having this. Why are you running Windows in places you don't need to run Windows conversation?
awesome.
There's
Well, I appreciate.
any parting thoughts?
No, like I said, uh, not necessarily a new topic for us, but certainly top of mind, and we'll see where the conversation goes from here. So.
It'll be interesting to keep an eye on this one, see what happens. Number one, to CrowdStrike. I bet they recover. I bet in 3 years, this is, it's a meme, probably a meme already, but in 3 years, this is a drop in the bucket. And if you're smart, you bought CrowdStrike when it hit the bottom of the stock market value and goes back up. It's a good company. They just made a mistake. And the power and beauty of Windows allowed it to be just exponentially impactful.
Agreed.
All right, sir. I look forward to seeing you later this afternoon when you come in the office, and we'll do this again in 2 weeks.
All righty. Take care.
Thanks.